Fix my hair. There we go. Feeling colorful. I want to feel colorful today as we talk about color. Only we're not going to talk about it so much creatively, but we're going to talk about a little technical aspect of it. But let's get this going. Hey fiber friends, remember this swatch? Well, thank goodness it was just a swatch, because as beautiful as it is, when I went to go wash and block it, and you should always wash and block your swatches, I ended up with color that looked like this. Yikes. And if you look really closely at my swatch, you can see a little bit of magenta got into the lilac. There was bleeding. It really sucks when you get bleeding colors with your final project. The question is, did I have bleeding with my final project? No, I didn't. There was no bleeding here. How is that? Well, I'm gonna talk about that in this video. I'm gonna share with you why crocking and bleeding happens, what it is, and what we could do about it. So hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and let's talk about the bleeding edge of color. As always, before we start into the meat of the video, just want to give you a reminder that down in the description box, you will find timestamps to different parts of the video. I always hope that you'll watch through the whole thing at least one time, but sometimes you have to get to something specific. Down in the description box, you will also find a list of materials and resources that I think are helpful from today's video. Some of these will have clearly marked affiliate links, and if you click on one of those links and then you end up doing some shopping, I might earn a small commission, and this really does help support my channel. So if you utilize one of my affiliate links, or you leave me a tip through SuperThanks or through Buy Me a Coffee, thank you so much. That extra support is so greatly appreciated. So crocking is basically when pigment comes off from dry fabric. If you've ever gotten like a dark pair of jeans and you're wearing them and you rub your hands against them and all of a sudden your hands look like the color of your jeans, that's crocking. So crocking usually occurs in knitting or crochet or fiber arts when you are in the middle of working on your project. All of a sudden your hands get a little bit of dye on them, or they're coming off your needles or your crochet hook. Crocking generally is not an indication that the yarn has been poorly dyed. It normally just means that there's a little bit of excess pigment still in the yarn that can't quite hold on, and then once the yarn gets some abrasion, that excess dye just comes out. Other things that can cause dye to loosen up, just other than friction and excess dye, is your skin chemistry. Your own skin chemistry sometimes can react with the dye and some will come off. Also, if you're wearing any lotions on your hands, sometimes the chemistry of that can cause some of the dye to kind of, loosen and come off on your hands. So crocking generally is more of an annoyance than a problem, especially if you are working on a single color project. That little bit of excess dye that's in the yarn will come out when you first wash it, and then you should be fine from there after. What you'll want to do is you'll want to wash your project, rinse it. Even if you're using a no rinse wool wash, go ahead and rinse the yarn or the project and just keep rinsing it until there's no more dye coming out. And once that happens, you should be good to go. So for my project, I did not experience crocking. What I did experience was bleeding because my color water changed after I washed and blocked my swatch. So bleeding is when color comes off from the yarn during the wash process. And the reasons for bleeding can be a little bit more complex than with crocking. So color bleeding can happen for a couple of different reasons. One, just like crocking, sometimes yarn has a bit of excess dye in it, and when you go to wash your project for the first time, that excess dye will get washed out, and once your rinse water runs clear, you should be good to go. Color is more likely to bleed when you wash your project in warmer water. So if you are using bright colors like this, you might want to consider using a lower temperature of your water when you're washing your project. The third reason that sometimes some excess dye can come off of the yarn, and this is somewhat the trickiest to deal with, is if your water at home is either harder or softer than the water that was used during the dyeing process, that difference between the two types of water can actually cause some of the dye to come out. And I'm pretty sure that's actually what happened with this swatch. The last reason that you can find bleeding in yarn is the one that kind of sucks the most, because there actually was a problem with the dyeing process itself. Maybe you have seen my video on the rise and fall of mystical creation yarns. If you haven't, it's kind of a fun video. I will link it up here and down in the description box below. But in that, I tell a story about a blog post where somebody used this yarn for mystical creations, and when they went to go wash their project, it just bled like crazy, and it was red yarn, and so it just looked like a bloodbath, and like she kept trying to rinse the excess dye out, and it just kept bleeding. If you find that's the case for you, if you are washing a project and every time you rinse, just more dye is coming out, and a lot of it, you know, not just a little bit of pink like this water here, but like really like a lot of color in your water, that's a pretty good sign that the yarn itself was not dyed properly, that the dye was not set properly. And if that's the case, I personally would choose to seek a refund. You can get on the Googles and find ways to try to reset the color at home, but frankly, for me personally, from what I've read, it's a lot of work, not a guarantee that it will work, and not something I really just want to go through. I'd rather just get my money back. But that's me. You might be more industrious in this regard. If I'm working on a single color project, color bleeding is not necessarily the end of the world. Some excess dye comes out in the wash, that's fine. I just rinse out the excess dye and I can move my life along. But color bleeding is more of an issue when you're dealing with color work projects, whether it's something like a Fair Isle project like this, or you have stripes, just stripes. Remember, stripes is a color work project. But anytime you have a project where you have more than one color in it, then I'm gonna be more concerned about bleeding. So when you're looking at yarn, how can you tell if it might bleed or not? Well, some of it is looking at the color itself. If it's a very bright color, like this magenta, there's a good chance that it might bleed. If it's a very dark color, especially navy blue, it can easily bleed. Also, oranges and reds generally are known to be less color fast than other colors. And again, this comes down to chemistry. So if you are working with any of those types of colors, you know, it's always worth doing a strand test just to see what the color fastness might be, and then you can decide how you want to move forward using that yarn or not. Do the strand test, get a bowl of warm water. Clear or white bowl is ideal. Then put your 6 to 12 inch strand of yarn into the water, and you're going to let that saturate in the water for a good 20 to 30 minutes. When you come back, if the water is clear like here, that's a really good sign. But let's do a second test with a white towel or a paper towel. Put the strand in it and rub the towel along the strand. If there's no dye on the towel, good sign. The strand test is a really good idea to do, but it's not a foolproof method of knowing whether or not your yarn is going to bleed once you actually go and wash it. I know because I did a strand test for this, and my strand test came out clear. This is another good reason actually to do a swatch if color bleeding is a concern for you with the project. And I would always much rather get color bleeding on a swatch than on my final project, because my gosh, look how gorgeous this is. And I would not want to spend the rest of my life with this project staring at every little bleeding spot. Maybe you wouldn't be obsessive like that. I am. This is where knowing yourself is really important. And I look at this swatch and immediately every time I'm like, bleeding, 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 bleeding. But that's me. It may not be you. You always get to decide how you want to move forward with your projects. This is just how I am. What if you, like me, are working a color work project where you don't want bleeding to happen and you discover through your strand test or through washing and blocking your swatch that there is bleeding? Well, one, you can always choose different colors. I mean, that is an option. I was not going to choose that option. I was using this magenta, okay? I was using the magenta. So what I chose to do is to go through a process that would take care of the excess dye before I cast it on my project, and that was pre-washing my yarn. If you just heard pre-washing your yarn and went, ew, I don't know about that. I don't know if I would want to do that. Understandable, trust me. I was getting on with my fiber friends online and going, guys, is there any way around this? Pre-washing my yarn. And some of them were dyers and they were pretty much like, your best bet is just to pre-wash your yarn. So I bit the bullet, and it's not that tedious a process. It is something that it's kind of a speed bump on the way to casting on the final project, but much like swatching, sometimes those speed bumps are a good thing to help us prevent problems in the future. Because remember, proper prep prevents problems. If your yarn is in a skein like this, or a donut, or any other thing that's not a hank, you're going to want to take your skein and you're going to want to turn it into a hank. Because A, you want to make sure that all of the yarn gets well and washed, and you don't want to end up with a tangly dangly mess, and you don't want anything to felt. And suffice it to say, best thing to do is to get it into a hank. So for me, this is where my Swift came in really handy. So I set up my Swift and I just tied my yarn onto one of the posts, dropped the yarn on the floor to give it some tension. Once it was set up, all I had to do was start spinning the Swift. Now, if you don't have a Swift like this, you can wind your yarn around the back of a chair or set up two sturdy cans, anything that allows you to get the yarn into a hank. If you've ever worked with a hank, you know that the hank always has these strings tied into it, right? These are called chokes. Yarn and string kept under tension will not knot, okay? But once you take it off of tension, it can easily knot, very easily knot. And so that's the purpose of the chokes, is to prevent the yarn from tangling it. You're gonna wanna tie in some chokes yourself. For this, I just used some doubled over crochet thread to do what's called a figure 8. I brought that through halfway through my hank. I brought that up over the top, and then I went back down where I entered. Then I took my two tails and put them through that loop. And then I took the tails and I just did an overhead knot to secure the whole thing. When tying those chokes into the hank, I did try to keep things pretty loose because I wanted my yarn to be able to move in the water, but I just wanted to make sure that my yarn stayed organized as well. And when tying chokes, I liked to put in 4, kind of like equidistant from each other, but I definitely want to put in a choke where there is an end to my yarn. And I secure those yarn ends by tying them onto the tail of the string as well, so the yarn won't accidentally slip out of the choke during washing. With my hank secured, I was then able to take it off the Swift, and it was ready to be washed. For the wash, I did follow the washing instructions on my ball band. So I filled this tub with 1 gallon of warm water, and then I added a teaspoon of wool wash in accordance to the wool wash directions. And I add something I don't normally, which is 1 cup of white distilled vinegar. Then I took my hank and I submerged it into the water. Now this yarn that I'm using is Knit Pick Swish, and it is a superwash yarn. So I wasn't worried about felting, but if you're working with a wool that could felt, make sure that you don't agitate your water, because you do not want to accidentally felt your yarn when you're doing a pre-wash. After I submerged my yarn into the water, knew it was saturated, I just let it be, walked away for 30 minutes and let it soak.
After the 30 minutes was up, I came up and I very gently picked up my yarn and kind of gathered it into my hands so that I could dump out the water. Now you'll notice that my water is clear.
I think the reason I didn't get any bleeding when I pre-washed my yarn is because of the vinegar that I added to the wash in that case. Had there been any bleeding, I would have dumped out the water and then I would have, with cold water, rinsed the yarn and rinsed out the yarn until there was no more dye coming off the yarn.
With my yarn cleaned, I now needed it to dry. So I put my yarn on a towel, just like I would with the hand knit, folded that towel up, and then very gently squeezed out any extra water that was still in the yarn. Once I had squeezed out as much water as I could, I then took my hank and hung it over a hanger like this, and then hung that up in my bathroom to dry. It took about 24 hours to dry.
So it didn't take that long for my yarn to dry after I pre-washed it. Once it was fully dried, then I took my hank, put it on the Swift, and wound my cakes back up. And I think taking that extra step was well worth it because, as I said earlier, my final project, there is no bleeding. Adding vinegar to your wash water is kind of an old trick to help control bleeding and help keep your yarn color fast. A lot of people think that what the vinegar is doing is refixing, resetting the dye to the yarn. That is highly unlikely.
So I could try to go in deep as to why vinegar is most likely not refixing the dye if you just put it in your regular wash water. It has a lot to do with chemistry and how the dyeing process works and how colors get fixed in the dyeing process, but that is like way more than what this video is about. So I'm just going to share with you why I think the vinegar made a difference for my wash water.
Well, vinegar is such a special substance because vinegar is naturally a water softener. Yes, and I know that my water locally is harder water. So I think that the combination of the vinegar, the soap, and the water created a wash water that was more similar to what was used when my yarn was dyed, and then the bleeding was prevented. And moving forward, whenever I use this yarn for a project, I'm going to add some vinegar to my wash water to help prevent any bleeding. But yeah, now this is also why vinegar added to your wash water may not work with every yarn or for everybody. Because again, if you have softer water than the water that was used to dye the yarn, adding vinegar is just going to soften the water even more. It's not going to create harder water. You would need harder water to help make up that difference. So vinegar softening your water may not work for you, but it's definitely, if you're finding a yarn is bleeding, definitely worth trying. Something else that you might want to consider adding to your wash if you are having any issues with color bleeding is color catching sheets. You might have used these in your regular laundry to help catch colors. They do work very well, and you can use them in your hand wash water as well. So that is something else you might want to consider doing. So that is what I have learned about color bleeding, crocking, and what you can do about it. And really the answer kind of comes down to the same thing, that as long as the yarn isn't defective itself, there's going to be something you're going to have to do in terms of washing. That's really what it comes down to. It's pretty simple. But But yeah, I would love to hear from you down in the comments below what your experiences have been with color bleeding, any tips or tricks that you might know that I haven't shared today because I didn't find them or don't know about them. As always, yes, I like to think I have a breadth of knowledge, but I'm always learning. One of my favorite things about fiber arts is there's always something to learn, and this is an opportunity for us to all learn and share with each other. So if you have any tips or tricks, please let me know down in the comments below. If you have any questions, anything at all. If you just want to say hi, love to hear from you down in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you found this video helpful. If so, please make sure to give this video a like and share with your other fiber art friends. Liking videos, sharing videos is a great free way to help support my channel. And if you have not already, please make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye.